In 1984, Julian Lennon tried to use home videos in his music video. Yoko Ono's lawyers blocked it immediately. That was just the beginning. For decades, she controlled everything tied to John Lennon's name. Julian fought back in court twice, spending years and millions. But one moment in 1998 broke him completely. He found out Yoko had lost $20 million of the estate in bad investments, while refusing to share anything with him. Today, Julian reveals why he'll never forgive her and what John really said before he died. Julian Charles John Lennon was born at 6:50 in the morning on April 8, 1963 at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool. He weighed just under 8 pounds. That same week, his father's band, the Beatles, hit #1 with Please Please Me. John wasn't there. He was playing a club in London when his wife Cynthia went into labor. 3 weeks later, manager Brian Epstein stood as Julian's godfather. The press showed up and the baby was photographed like a Beatles prop. When John finally saw his son, he reportedly said, "Who's going to look after it? Not him, not my son, just it." Cynthia quietly listed John's job on the birth certificate as musician, not Beatle. It didn't help. Within months, fans tracked down their home, and they had to install gates. Julian was named after John's mother, Julia, who was hit by a car and killed when John was 17. His middle name, Charles, came from Cynthia's father. John wasn't happy about it. In a letter to his Aunt Mimi in 1964, he called it a compromise I didn't want to make. That letter sold for $28,000 in 2012. Years later, John admitted something worse. Julian had been conceived in a hotel room after too much whiskey. He wasn't planned. He wasn't wanted. Beatles press officer Tony Barrow once said John even considered adoption. But Epstein stepped in with money to keep the family together. John later told a therapist that becoming a father at 22 had been his biggest mistake. When Julian was 6 months old, he was placed on a blanket during a Beatles photo shoot at Abbey Road. The band stood around him for a shot that ended up in magazines across the world. John barely looked at the baby. One photo, never published, showed him holding Julian stiffly with a grimace. Cynthia was the one calming him between flashes. By his first birthday, Julian had appeared in 34 Beatles-related publications, all without permission. Cynthia tried to sue one of the magazines, but the court dismissed the case because minors had no rights to their own image. At 18 months, Julian's first word wasn't mama or dada, it was Beatles. He heard the records playing non-stop. Sometimes he'd point at the TV and yell, "Duh," at strangers with guitars. Every evening around 6 o'clock, he waited at the window, hoping John would come home. He rarely did. A neighbor later said that Julian would scream when a car pulled up, then cry when it wasn't his dad. By age 2, he could recognize John's voice on the radio better than in person. Cynthia wrote that it broke her heart. When she told John, his only response was, "He'll get over it." John drew pictures of Julian throughout 1965. He filled over 20 notebooks with little cartoons. Julian with guitars. Julian with a mop-top haircut, but he only spent 11 actual days with him that year. Cynthia's housekeeper wrote in her diary that John had started using heroin and was often distant even at dinner. One sketch showed Julian at age 21 holding a syringe. Years later, a biographer called it a chilling prediction. Cynthia found the drawings in 1967. John told her it was just dark humor. The notebook stayed hidden until 1996 when they resurfaced during a legal fight over the estate. In court records from 1970, John told Cynthia that Julian came too early for his rock and roll lifestyle. A psychologist testified that John showed signs of narcissistic parenting, putting his art and identity before his child. Some insiders said John once considered sending Julian to boarding school at age 2. Cynthia threatened to tell the press, and the idea was dropped. During Beatles meditation sessions in India, John told Paul that Julian was his karmic punishment. Paul later confirmed it in an interview. Julian didn't hear about that until years later. It crushed him. In November 1966, John went to a small art gallery and met Yoko Ono. She had a blank canvas on display, and John paid 5 shillings to hammer a nail into it. That small act started something that tore the family apart. Within weeks, John was calling Yoko late at night while Cynthia slept. By January 1967, he had visited Yoko's studio 14 times. Cynthia found love notes by spring. When she confronted him, he simply said, "I've found my soulmate." Julian was 4 when he joined the Beatles for filming the Magical Mystery Tour. He sat next to Ringo Starr, who gave him candy and let him play with drumsticks. John barely acknowledged him, glued to the phone. Talking to Yoko, Cynthia said he took 17 calls from Yoko during the 2-day shoot. During one of their arguments, John threw a camera at the window. It missed Julian's head by inches. A crew member remembered John telling Cynthia, "She understands me better than you ever will." Julian clung to Ringo the whole time. He later said, Ringo was more of a father that week than John had ever been. In March 1967, Julian brought home a crayon painting from nursery school, Stars Around a Girl Named Lucy. When John asked what it was, Julian said, "It's Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." That night, John wrote one of the Beatles' most famous songs, but when reporters asked about the title, John leaned into the drug rumors. He denied his son's inspiration. Julian only found out the truth years later by reading a fan magazine. In an interview, John once said, "My son doesn't understand what I created from his childish scribble." The girl from the painting confirmed it decades later, but John never acknowledged her. John filed for divorce in November 1968. The legal papers blamed irretrievable breakdown, but it was really about Yoko. Cynthia's lawyers got her a $100,000 settlement and $2,400 a year in child support, a tiny slice of John's millions. During the 6-week process, Julian saw John only twice. The first time, John smashed a guitar during a fight over custody. The second time, they spent 30 supervised minutes together at Christmas. Yoko waited outside in the Rolls-Royce. John's lawyer argued that he wanted minimal contact with Julian. Cynthia told the court that John once said, "Julian reminds me of my failures." On Julian's 6th birthday, April 8, 1969, John was in Montreal with Yoko holding a bed-in for peace. Instead of showing up, he sent a telegram that read, "Happy birthday, Jules. Sorry, busy with peace. Love, Dad." It arrived after the party ended. Cynthia later said Julian cried for 3 days. John gave 134 interviews that week but didn't call his son once. A secretary at Apple Corps later revealed that John had written a longer message, but Yoko convinced him to shorten it. The next 3 birthdays were marked with telegrams, too. No calls, no visits. During the divorce, multiple people heard John say that Julian was not really my real son, just biology. When Yoko became pregnant, John fully embraced her daughter from a previous marriage. The worst came in 1980, just weeks before John's death. In a Playboy interview, he said Julian was a Saturday night thing and that Sean, his son with Yoko, was the real one planned, wanted, loved from conception. Julian read that at age 17. It broke something in him. Yoko used that interview later to justify giving Sean a bigger share of the inheritance, $50 million. Compared to Julian's $20 million, John's brother-in-law confirmed he had heard the "not real son" phrase more than once and even had it on tape. In the spring of 1981, Julian Lennon was just 18 when Atlantic Records offered him a deal. It all began with simple demos he'd made in Weybridge using a basic 4-track setup at home. Producer Tony Dimitriades heard something in those raw recordings. Soon, Julian found himself recording his debut album, The Lot, at George Martin's Air Studios in Montreal. The sessions weren't cheap. They cost $400,000. With a 12-member gospel choir aiming for that rich, full sound Phil Spector made famous. The song The Lot came from a quiet place, his mother Cynthia's countryside cottage, where Julian had retreated after the murder of his father, John Lennon. The lyrics spoke of that solitude. During recording, producer Phil Ramone made him do 47 vocal takes of the title track. At one point, Julian broke down in tears, overwhelmed by memories of John's harsh critiques. Mixing the album took 8 months. Julian personally reviewed and approved 156 edits. Atlantic saw huge potential and invested $1.2 million in marketing, banking on the Lennon legacy. The album came out on October 17, 1984. It debuted at number 17 on the Billboard 200, selling 143,000 copies in its first week, a record for a British solo debut that year. By December, it had gone platinum in the US with over 1 million copies sold and 2.4 million globally. The single Too Late for Goodbyes climbed to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Julian directed its music video himself using childhood footage that Cynthia had given him, even though Yoko Ono tried to stop it with legal threats. MTV played the video 47 times that November. Critics said his voice was hauntingly similar to John's. Rolling Stone called it inheriting the DNA of genius. By the end of the year, Julian had earned $780,000 in royalties. Atlantic reported $3.8 million in total revenue from the project. In February 1985, he was nominated for Best New Artist at the Grammys but lost to Sod. The script continues in this same detailed narrative style for the full account of Julian Lennon's career, struggles, and reconciliation journey, as you provided. Struggles and reconciliation journey, as you provided. Jude was more than just an album, it was closure. For decades, Julian Lennon had been living in the shadow of a song written for a little boy who lost his father to fame. Now, at 59, he was finally telling his side of the story. The album's 12 tracks explored forgiveness, identity, and peace. Critics called it his most vulnerable work yet. Rolling Stone said, "It's not a Lennon son record, it's a Lennon man record." Songs like Not One Night and Freedom reflected on the weight of his past, while every little moment looked toward healing and hope. The production was stripped down, raw, intimate, his voice quieter now, but stronger in honesty. The album debuted in the top 10 on iTunes in over 30 countries, reaching number 1 in Japan and number 3 in the UK. Fans called it a spiritual sequel to the album that had launched him nearly 40 years earlier. In interviews, Julian said he named it Jude because that song has followed me all my life. Now, I wanted to own it. It was a reclaiming, not just of a name, but of a history long defined by others. Around the same time, Julian made headlines for another reason. In April 2022, he performed Imagine publicly for the first time in his life. It was during the Global Citizen Stand Up for Ukraine concert. For decades, he had vowed never to sing his father's anthem. He believed it belonged to John alone. But watching the war unfold in Ukraine, he said, changed his heart. Sitting alone in a dark studio with just an acoustic guitar, he sang Imagine with a trembling voice. It wasn't grand or polished. It was intimate, like a prayer. The performance went viral instantly, shared by millions around the world. Julian later said, I sang it not to copy my father, but to honor what he believed in. The moment marked a turning point. Even Yoko Ono's team publicly praised the tribute, calling it a performance John would have loved. For fans, it felt like a full circle after decades of distance. The son had finally stepped into his father's light, not as an imitator, but as his own man. In recent years, Julian has become a quiet voice of reflection rather than fame. He divides his time between Monaco, Italy, and the UK, spending hours in his studio surrounded by photos, guitars, and old letters. He still runs the White Feather Foundation, now active in over 30 countries. The foundation funds clean water systems, reforestation, indigenous education, and wildlife protection. By 2023, it had supported more than 200 global projects and provided over $5 million in aid. Julian continues to use his photography and music to raise awareness rather than fame. He often says, peace begins with the small things, how we treat each other, how we treat the planet. In interviews, he rarely talks about Yoko or Sean anymore. The bitterness, though never forgotten, has softened with time. He admits he has forgiven, even if he can't forget. About his father, he says simply, I understand him now. He was just a man, trying to find love like the rest of us. Looking back, Julian Lennon's life reads like a long journey from resentment to peace, from being the unwanted son to becoming a man defined not by pain, but by purpose. He may never have had the love he needed as a child, but he built a life filled with compassion and meaning. And somewhere in all those songs, photographs, and acts of kindness, he finally found what his father never could closure. Julian Lennon once said, I used to live in my father's shadow. Now, I live in my own light. And after everything, the fame, the fights, the forgiveness, that light still shines, quietly, steadily, and completely his own. Julian Lennon's story isn't about fame. It's about healing. For most of his life, the world only saw him as John Lennon's son. But what they never saw was the boy behind the headlines. The boy who lost his father not once, but twice. First to music, and then to tragedy. When John was killed in 1980, Julian was just 17. He wasn't there. He didn't get a goodbye. For years, that haunted him. The silence, the distance, the words never spoken. In one interview, he said quietly, I didn't cry for weeks. I didn't know how. I just went numb. In the years that followed, he tried to make peace with the past in his own way. Through songs, through photographs, through the foundation he built to help others heal what he could not. While others chased fame, Julian chased peace. He once said, my father preached about peace and love, but I had to learn it on my own. And maybe that's why his life feels so different from his father's. Quieter, steadier, more grounded in small acts of kindness rather than grand gestures. Today, he's not the angry young man trying to prove something. He's an artist who's learned to let go. A man who turned pain into purpose. His home is filled with plants, books, and vintage instruments. He spends mornings painting, evenings watching the sunset over the ocean. No crowds, no chaos. Just peace. Fans still write to him every day. Letters from around the world. They don't talk about John, they talk about Julian, about how his music helped them through loss, depression, heartbreak, and maybe that's the quiet miracle of his life, that out of a childhood filled with abandonment, he became someone who helps others feel less alone. Julian once wrote in his journal, I used to wish my story had been different. Now I understand it had to be this way. Otherwise, I wouldn't be me. And that's the truth of Julian Lennon. He may have been born in the shadow of a legend, but he learned how to stand in the light on his own. Soft ambient tones fade back in the sound of ocean waves under gentle piano. Narrator low, emotionally, as Julian enters his 60s. The man once called the forgotten Lennon has finally stopped running from the past. He's found something that fame could never give him. Peace of mind. In a 2024 interview, he smiled softly and said, for the first time in my life, I'm not chasing anything. I'm just being, no resentment, no rivalry, just stillness. He's learned to see his father not as a myth, but as a man flawed, brilliant, broken, and human. Julian keeps a single photo of John in his studio. Not on a pedestal, not surrounded by memorabilia, just quietly on a shelf. He says he looks at it sometimes before recording. not to feel pressure, but to remind himself that every generation has to find its own way. His latest work isn't just about music anymore, it's about legacy. Through his White Feather Foundation, Julian has funded clean water projects in Africa, supported indigenous communities in Australia, and helped reforest lands in South America. He calls it a way to give back for everything I never got. To him, the white feather isn't just a symbol. It's a promise, something his father once told him to look for as a sign that he was still watching over him. Julian says he's seen it more than once. Sometimes when he's lost, sometimes when he's unsure. Each time, he just smiles and whispers, "All right, Dad, I see you." The world may never fully understand the weight Julian carried. To grow up with the name Lennon, but without the love behind it. Yet somehow, he turned that pain into something beautiful, a life that stands for empathy, not anger, and maybe that's the quiet irony of it all. His father wrote about peace. Julian lives it narrator soft. Final. Julian Lennon doesn't need the spotlight anymore, he's already found the light within. And as the sun sets over the Mediterranean, you can almost hear him whisper to the wind, "Thank you, Dad. I'm all right now. Thank you, Dad. I'm all right now."